morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Or good evening, wherever you are. I think we will get started and let people trickle in as they do. My name is Maitland, and I'd like to welcome you today to Who's Technology, a Tool of Social Justice or Control. I'm a board member for the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, also known as CRIAW. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional territories of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. Due to colonialism, this land is also known today as Toronto, Canada. I want to acknowledge that the legacy of colonization against Indigenous people in Canada is ongoing and embedded in our institutions. Colonialism is one of the many systems of oppression that continues around the world, and that is something that we will keep top of mind during our event today, and something that I hope we'll be able to discuss. I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, as well as where you're joining from, and to learn more about the land where you are living and the people who are Indigenous to that land. You can visit native-land.ca. Please also note that the main event today will be recorded and posted on CRIA's website. However, the small group discussions in the breakout rooms will not be recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please just leave your camera off. So to start, I'll give a little bit of an introduction to CRIA and who we are. The Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women is a national nonprofit feminist institute dedicated to intersectional research and action for the advancement of women's substantive equality in Canada. Since 1976, we've been conducting feminist research and producing tools and resources that can be used by activists and organizations for the advancement of women's rights. We produce plain language research and research tools using a feminist intersectional lens. We're a national non-for-profit, and we're a member-based organization made up of academia and community-based feminist researchers. As part of our work, CRIA has been exploring the impacts of new technologies on women's rights and feminist organizing since the 1980s. We're interested in this topic because we know that information and communication technologies, which I'll refer to as ICTs, are often portrayed as neutral, but it is well documented that these technologies reproduce inequalities, systemic discrimination, racism, misogyny, and are used by governments to facilitate surveillance and oppression. Today's event will aim to facilitate knowledge sharing and network building to strengthen our collective analysis of ICTs in relation to unequal power relations and feminist organizing. Today, we'll focus on how ICTs are used by individuals as well as big tech corporations and governments to maintain power and reproduce inequalities, and how feminist principles can guide a regulatory framework for accountability. We will start by hearing from two panelists who will speak to this topic from their work and personal experiences. And we've reserved a few minutes for a brief Q&A after the presentation, so please share any questions you have for the panelists in the chat. After the presentations, we'll be breaking out into some Zoom breakout rooms to discuss what we've learned and share our personal reflections, building from today's presentations and our personal experiences. And in addition to the presentations, to help inspire some discussion, we've created a few questions. So number one is, what is the transformational potential and the limitations of using ICTs to build feminist movements and solidarities? Number two is, whose responsibility is it to prevent violence and exploitation facilitated by ICTs? And number three, how do we move forward towards a feminist regulatory framework for ICTs? So we're hoping to come together today to build on each other's knowledge and experience to better understand the potential harms of ICTs on women and the feminist movement, and move towards that framework of accountability. We will be compiling information from this session and sharing it in a summary report. I'll just take a moment to also plug our event from last year's NGO CSW, which was on the rise of the far right in Canada. The recording of that event and its summary report are available on CRIA's website if you're interested in that. And without further ado, I will introduce our panelists, and please do remember that if you have a question for any of them during their presentation, you can leave it in the chat. So our first panelist is Noura Aljizawi, who is a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy where she researches the intersections of tech, human rights, and global security with a focus on targeted digital threats against civil society, digital authoritarianism, and digital transnational repression. Noura currently serves as a board member of the Center of Victims of Torture and is a member of the expert group of Humanitarian Dialogue. She's also a member of the steering committee of Just Tech and Migration Community. Her contributions to the fields have been recognized with an Excellence Through Innovation Award from the University of Toronto for her work on Security Planner, which is a user-friendly platform that provides peer-reviewed recommendations for staying safe online. We're also joined by Rhiannon Wong, who is the project manager for Women Shelters Canada's new Technology Safety Canada project. Through her project addressing tech-facilitated gender-based violence, Rhiannon has been researching and developing practical technology safety resources and training for Canadian anti-violence workers, women, girls, and gender diverse people that address how technology can be used both to keep women and children safe and misused by perpetrators to commit crimes of intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual assault, impersonation, and harassment. And I will start by passing it on to Noura.
Thank you very much for this warm introduction and for having me. Like today, I will discuss, as you mentioned in the opening, the technology in promoting the role of technology in promoting social justice or control. This is a very huge question, and I believe like we need to discuss this further. This 10 minutes, I doubt that it would be enough. However, I will try to touch bases on the headlines and the main topics in this, and happy to learn more from the participants in the Q&A. When we talk about the potential of utilizing information communication technology to build feminist movements and solidarity, we must recognize that these technologies are often co-opted by those in power to surveil and control marginalized communities. For instance, mercenary spyware and other surveillance technologies are increasingly being used by state or state-related actors to target civil society and journalists, especially those who challenge their authority or expose their abuses. Further, authoritarian regimes have been using digital transnational repression to target and intimidate activists, dissidents, and human rights defenders who are in exile. For instance, last year, we published a report about the digital transnational repression in Canada. These threats are often gendered, with women, LGBTQ individuals, and other marginalized groups being particularly vulnerable to violence and exploitation facilitated by technology. Digital transnational repression is practice of these regimes to expand their authoritarianism and power over these people. And like in particular, when it comes to women and LGBTQ people are particularly vulnerable, whether at home country, but the focus is more now in my research on exile, because if they are newcomers, they are less likely to have support networks and financial and solidarity and other means of support that they are really needed. Which is it has a very severe impact also on their well-being, day-to-day life, and by result, like for sure, on their activism. For instance, from Saudi Arabia, there is a woman, human rights defenders who fled the country after facing arrest and detention, has been like targeted with spyware and hacking attempts, as well as threats to their families who are still in the country. Similarly, LGBTQ activists from the countries like Egypt and China have been subjected to online harassment and blackmail, as well as offline attacks, unfortunately, by their home countries, by the governments of their home countries. However, in liberal democracies, women in public spheres, such as journalists, politicians, and feminist activists, are increasingly becoming targets of digital surveillance and harassment. This can include invasive hacking attempts, leaking of private information, doxing, spread of false or damaging information on social media. These tactics can have a chilling effects on women's ability to participate in public discourse, and can also put them at risk of physical harm. In addition to online harassment and surveillance, women's access to healthcare, particularly reproductive healthcare, is also being targeted online. Women seeking information about abortion or other productive healthcare options may find themselves targeted with misleading or false information, or may also be subjected to online stalking and harassment. We've been following the tragic news in the United States, with some states passing laws restricting abortion or reinforcing existing laws that criminalize the procedure. There are very, very serious concerns raised about that digital information could be used against them by law enforcement agencies investigating or prosecuting abortion-related cases. This information included search history, location, data, messages, and other digital data. Data from period tracking and pregnancy applications could be also used as evidence against people who have helped women obtain abortion in state where it's crime to do so. Digital rights and freedom activist groups are warning people to safeguard their digital footprint when seeking abortion information and resources online. We can talk a lot about this, which is amazing as a mean of resistance. But besides all of these dark, tragic incidents and realities, painful realities about the technology, feminist activists, both in their home countries, exile, in liberal democracies, in authoritarian context, are also paying a lot of efforts to reclaim technology for social justice by using social media and other digital platforms to connect and mobilize. Feminists also have been able to amplify their voices and demand accountability from those in power. Me Too movement, for instance, was largely driven by social media and has helped to bring attention to the pervasive problem of sexual harassment and assault in many industries, and it became a global movement. Similarly, activists in countries like Iran have used WhatsApp and other encrypted messaging applications like Signal to organize protests and other forms of resistance against the repressive regime. So the question is, whose responsibility is to prevent technology-related abuses? Government and technology companies certainly have a big role to play, but it's also important to recognize the power of grassroots movements in holding those in power into account. Feminist activists in particular have been calling for greater transparency and accountability from technology companies and for development of alternative technologies that prioritize the safety and autonomy of all users, especially those who are most vulnerable to be abused. One promising approach to feminist regulation of technology is the concept of feminist data governance. This approach seeks to ensure that data is collected and used in a way that reflect feminist values, including transparency, accountability, and participation. It's also recognized the importance of diverse and intersectional perspective in shaping technology policy and practice, and calls for greater representation of women and other marginalized groups in technology-related decision-making. But feminist data governance is not just a theoretical concept. It has also been put in practice by organizations like the Association for Progressive Communication, APC, which has developed a set of feminist principles for internet that aim to promote a more just and equitable online environment. These principles include the right to access and create digital content, the right to privacy and data protection, and the right to participate in shaping technology policy and practice. Moving forward, as feminist activists, we must continue to advocate for a feminist regulatory framework that takes into account the power dynamics and gender impacts of technology use and address the gender dimensions of digital threats. This includes not just regulating the behavior of state and companies, but also empowering civil society organizations and individuals to monitor and challenge abuses in real time. We must also support the development of alternative technologies that are designed with feminist values and principles in mind, and that prioritize the safety and autonomy of all users, especially those who are most vulnerable to abuse. While technology has the potential to be a powerful tool for social justice, we must also recognize its potential to be used for control and oppression. As feminist activists, we have a huge role to play. We can remain our efforts in holding those in power accountable and to push for regulatory framework. But also what we can do is support victims in different means, advocating for legal policy framework, hold states and companies accountable for their actions, and supporting the victims of online harassment and gender-based violence, not only in digital means, but also psychologically and emotionally, and ensure that technology is developed and used in ways that reflect feminist values. I can conclude here, and I'm happy to learn from everyone here in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noura and Rhiannon.
Great, thank you so much. So I guess I'll just dive into my portion here. Thank you everybody for joining today and inviting me to be here. The work that we do at Women's Shelters Canada is a little bit different, or very different than what Noura does over at CIPIC. But the goal, so I'll frame. So I'll tell you a little bit about our project, and then I'll go into some of these questions. So the goal of the Tech Safety Canada project is really to equip domestic violence shelter and transition house workers and survivors accessing these programs with the information and resources they need to support survivors coming into programs with their experiences of tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So we're doing this through developing resources within toolkits, which hopefully I can show you in a little bit, and training that we're doing across the country. And so we've partnered and we're doing this in partnership with the National Network to End Domestic Violence in the United States, the WestNet Project in Australia, and Refuge in the UK. And so the goal for us as an international group doing this tech safety work for domestic and sexual violence programs in our own countries is to share resources so that we have the most up-to-date resources, share them with each other so that we have the most up-to-date resources for folks within our own countries to use when they need it. So my take is a little bit different. So I'll start with the first question. What is the transformational potential and the limitations of utilizing ICTs to build feminist movements and solidarities? From what we've seen in our work, I think, well, my answer to this is very double-sided. By using technology for feminist movements and to promote solidarity, we've seen that not everyone can be included in the movement or or have access to resources. And this is because large parts of the world, or even here in Canada, a lot of people don't have adequate or affordable access to technology. And oftentimes this really does exclude many survivors in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities from these movements that we're trying to build. But I guess at the same time, using technology, specifically online platforms, does have the capacity to reach and include more people who are not living in these areas with low or no access to the internet. And so an example that I'd love to share is that we just launched our national website, techsafety.ca, and maybe I'll put that in the chat after I finish this, but or I can show you as well. So last week we launched our national website, techsafety.ca, and it provides information for survivors and frontline workers about tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And last week as well, we started our provincial and territorial trainings for frontline workers. And last week we did one for the shelter workers in Nunavut, and we realized that as we were doing this training, our feedback from this training is that the information that is posted on this brand new beautiful website is not going to help the women, youth, and gender diverse people experiencing tech facilitated gender-based violence in Nunavut, because a lot of folks don't have access to the internet. Some shelters themselves don't have access to the internet. And so now we're actually going back to our older ways of distributing materials to these shelters. So that's an example that we have that I thought that I would share with you. In terms of the next question, whose responsibility is it to prevent violence, and exploitation facilitated by ICTs? Personally, I think it has to be a multi-layered approach. There is a lot of pressure on ICT companies to do more, and this is completely true. But I do believe that it's more than that. From our work, we hear from many frontline workers and survivors that, law enforcement doesn't, or judges don't necessarily know how to hold abusers accountable for their misuse of technology to perpetrate violence, when we know that there are many criminal and civil remedies in existence already. And it's just like folks just aren't familiar with it. And part of it is the language that we use. What exactly is tech facilitated violence? What is tech abuse? What is online abuse? But when you break it down by behavior, the harassment, the uttering threats, the voyeurism, the stalking, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, all of those are legal remedies that we have within Canada here. Also, I think that we can't forget that technology isn't the problem, and that abuse is. In the work that we do specifically on tech facilitated gender-based violence in experiences of domestic and sexual violence, perpetrators and abusers, they choose to misuse technology for violence and exploitation. And the research is starting to show that if technology was taken away from a survivor's experience of tech facilitated gender-based violence, that the abuse likely would still exist in other forms of violence. So to us, I think, more has to be done to be able to hold the perpetrators and abusers accountable as well. And sorry, my presentation is going to be really short because I want to speak from our experience. So how do we move forward towards a feminist regulatory framework? Like I said, I think laws need to be updated. Folks on the ground doing the actual work of supporting people experiencing tech facilitated gender-based violence, survivors who are the voices of survivors who are experiencing tech facilitated gender-based violence need to be at the table and included in all of these discussions and consultations. Oftentimes, folks on the front line, survivors, they're not included in these big discussions and consultations. And I think regulators should turn to Cynthia Ku's deplatforming misogyny report that she authored for the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. And in this report, she examines digital platform liability for technology facilitated gender-based violence, abuse, and harassment. And within her report, she has 14 recommendations for federal government action and legislative reform. So I don't know if somebody could put that in the chat as well, but that's a really great start that I think that we should look at. So I don't know. My part is very short. And so I don't know if we want to share our website at all, or we can just go straight to the breakout rooms.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rhiannon. That was great. No worries at all. I think we're right on time.
Perfect.
Noura, what time did you have to leave by? Because I think you're running to something else.
Yeah, I think maximum 9:30.
9:30? Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure that we have time for some questions for you.
Thank you very much.
So I don't know if we have any questions in the chat yet. Oh, I have one here from Amrita. So Amrita has asked if Noura mentioned the ways that big tech can be held accountable in trying to prevent exploitation / power imbalance. So if you could touch on a little bit of those, and Rhiannon, if you have, you did touch on that a little bit at the end, but if anyone has any additional comments about that.
So shall I go first? I guess like there are, it depends on the jurisdiction in general, but I guess like the EU, for instance, is doing some good progress in this regard. It's not enough, absolutely. And there's a lot of criticism also about the GDPR and the missing sensitivity of gender and gender-based violence and the gender issues in regard of all of these digital technology. In terms of the examples I can just give as optimistic examples are the the accountability and the process that the civil society is leading against the digital surveillance technologies companies like NSO, Candero, and others, whom their harm was documented to be associated with severe human rights abuses. These kinds of baby steps, very small steps, is just opening the door for further opportunities in the future. However, like when it comes to Canada, I'm not that much optimistic. You know better than me about like the the criticism of the not only the privacy laws, but also in terms of the foreign states impunity. Taking the discussion back again to the digital transnational repression and how much like when it comes like to the accountability, the victims here in Canada, for instance, cannot dream of holding the perpetrators accountable just because these perpetrators are enjoying the immunity of being state actors. So like here and there are some opportunities and some very good work have been done. And also I believe like the advocacy of like aside from the accountability, the advocacy that civil society has been doing in terms of the encryption, the improving the privacy settings and so on has good impact on the behaviors of companies like WhatsApp and Signal. I always refer to them as good examples of being collaborative, prioritizing the safety and the privacy of users. But absolutely, when it comes to the work, we're still in the very early stages, and there's a lot of work have to be done. I wish I answered the question properly. Over to you, Rina.
For me, I think I just echo what Noura just said. I think that there's a lot of mainstream online platforms and ICT companies out there that are coming up with new ways to keep folks safe online or remedy some of the abuse or misuse of tech that is happening on their platforms, but yet, which is awesome. But then they're doing other things like using artificial intelligence to collect data of folks using their platforms and then sending out sending out more misogynistic videos and reels and information to people through algorithms and things like that. So, but I think Noura answered the question very well.
Thank you both. We have another question in the chat asking, are there differences or similarities in the nature of tech-facilitated violence and repression in different regions?
I guess this question is focused on the global aspect of gender-based violence facilitated by technology. In summary, I would say no. It's similar. We live under this global patriarchal societies and governments. I'm saying governments because working with women and LGBTQ people who are being targeted by state or state-related actors, there are a lot of similarities in the methods of targeting women in Canada and the United States and in different kinds of the global north, let's say. So even like when it comes to, excuse me, even when it comes to the behavior of states and state-related actors in leading such kinds of online targeting against women and LGBTQ people, it copies the same methods of other perpetrators, whether individuals or groups in different countries. So I guess like to be optimistic and to find like hope in this darkness, that makes it very easy to run global solidarity and to combat like globally, or to come together to combat these harmful abuses.
I can speak a little bit closer. I can speak to so this past December, we, our project surveyed shelter workers and transition house workers across the country to ask about their experiences or what they're seeing in their shelters and transition houses of tech, what are the most common forms of tech facilitated gender-based violence they're seeing in their shelter transition houses. And our preliminary results show that 95% of respondents, who are the frontline workers across the country who answered in every province and territory, said that they supported women coming into their shelters who've experienced tech facilitated gender-based violence. And the most common forms across the country were harassment, threats, and location tracking through smartphones, text messages, and laptops. Those were the most common forms of tech facilitated gender-based violence that we've seen across the country. So, so for us, it's the same, like within our work, that that there are similarities across the country. And I think you probably see the same thing. I think Susie Dunn is coming out with a report from the CIGI in April, where she's done research with over 18,000 people in a whole bunch of different countries. And so I would look out for that, but I think it'll show some similarities as well.
If I may add, like, I guess that the difference is in terms of the impact, the context where this tech facilitated gender-based violence is being conducted, whether in like when it comes to the global south, where there is these discriminatory laws, yeah, the impact absolutely is different. I hate to start the day of people talking about these tragedies, but just thinking about the honor crimes, thinking about many activists, many female activists, when their like personal photos were leaked by state or state-related actors on social media, and then they were murdered by their families just to protect the honor of the family. And unfortunately, these crimes are protected by the states. So this is like when it comes to the impact. However, the nature of these abuses are same, I guess.
Thank you both. It seems like generally tech facilitated gender-based violence is something that we are seeing everywhere across the world, and it will come in slightly different forms and levels of severity, but it really is, you know, it is all over the place the same way that offline misogyny and gender-based violence happens around the world as well. And just before we go into our breakout rooms, I wanted to give you both a chance as well to, if you have any positive examples of ways that you have seen ICTs be used to bring feminists together or bring different movements together, to be used as a tool to mobilize and to share knowledge and to share resources. If you had any examples that you wanted to share about the positive side of ICTs in the feminist movement as well.
Shall I go first? Thank you. Absolutely, there are a lot of positive sides. I mentioned in my opening remarks, Me Too, but definitely Me Too is one of many. Thinking of like the protests in Iran and how the female and LGBTQ activists are organizing, mobilizing, resisting the repressive regimes using the digital platforms, whether to communicate or even to separate the news about the abuses and their struggles. It's absolutely impressive. Like it's really fascinating. Yesterday we had a super inspiring panel with female human rights defenders from the MENA region, and we had very concrete examples about how much technology helped the women in the region, starting from the Arab Spring, that changed even the perspective of users towards technology. I gave examples, which is like the very latest example about how the Syrian women are using technology to help, and in a very good way, was the response of activists, and whether in diaspora or in the home country, to the earthquake. How social media platforms, regardless of whether they respect our privacy or not, they became these working and like emergency rooms of the response, whether to help and rescue people, gathering information about the missing people under rubble, or documenting the missing individuals, trying to connect the children with their families, because when the rescue operations were happening, there was no coordination. The children would be taken to by airplane or whatever, by helicopter, to a hospital, and no one would be able to connect them. Or even like in fundraising and other means of humanitarian response. But one of the very great examples that I feel so proud of, how we came together as Syrian women using technology for sure, and put together a document addressing the special needs of women, female survivors from the earthquake, and shared this guideline and document with all humanitarian organizations and actors, because unfortunately, until now, after 12 years of conflict, when there is any emergency humanitarian response, the women's needs are always forgotten. So these just kinds of good examples how technology could be used. Absolutely, there's a great example in Egypt, how the Me Too campaign was echoed in Egypt, and they like women came together using technology platforms to help in to support the survivors, and also to hold the perpetrators accountable. Not all of them, but at least some of them.
I don't know if anything can beat Noura's example of the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter movement but there are some smaller good things that are happening. Heart Mob, which is not Heart Mob anymore, but allowed folks to share their stories of harassment and get support from other people around the world on this website. And so I thought that was a really great initiative that was started locally by, or not locally, but it was started by, one person who saw a need and a problem, and was able to, folks share their story, and everybody who witnessed their story online was able to send words of encouragement, resources, hope for the people that were sharing their stories on their website. There's also there's a website called Hack Blossom, and they've come up with their own like DIY feminist cybersecurity website. And so folks are, going to this website and taking upon themselves to sort of take back tech and going through all of their settings, and, they're providing great information that is easy to understand, in hopes to promote digital literacy and safety online. So those are some of the initiatives that come to mind for me.
Thank you so much, both of you. We will soon be moving into our breakout rooms. I just want to take a moment to thank our two panelists so much for taking the time out of their very busy schedules. No problem at all if you two cannot stay into the breakout rooms. I think it'll go past 9:30, so feel free to exit the meeting as we go into the breakout rooms. But before we do that, I want to thank you both so much. It was so incredible to learn from both of you today. So thank you so much to Noura and Rhiannon, and we will now move into 3 breakout rooms to discuss the discussion questions I mentioned before. So there'll be 3 facilitators from CRIAW, Rita, Jackie, and Kelly, who will be leading your discussions. And then after 30 minutes, we'll be brought back into the main room where we will be able to hear a bit about the discussions and reflections that you had. And do know that what you say will be kept anonymous. The facilitators will not be attributing any quotes or phrases to any specific names, but just summarizing a bit of the discussion that you had. So thanks again to our panelists, and we'll see each other in 30 minutes. Hello, everyone. I think we have all made it back to the main room. I hope you had some great discussions in the other room. So I will start with Jackie, if that's okay, if you want to give us a bit of a recap of what you discussed.
Well, we had a really great discussion. And I think, and it ended, we could have probably talked for at least another half an hour minimum. But I think, and I think that this is just obviously the beginning of many, many more feminist conversations that have to happen. And that was kind of pretty clear within our own conversation. But what really came up a lot was this idea of privacy too, because as feminists, we have to protect, and as individuals in general, to protect our privacy. And, that's very challenging with this technology issue, right? So it's like, do we trust them? Even with the information we put out there as feminists using these technologies, how do we trust that the message that we put out there is the true message that's out there? So that was a big theme that came up too, because you can produce anything you want and it can be changed online. So also, it's like anything, again, the potential, like the first question, the potential for great things, but also the potential for awful things, right? So that came up too. And it's like, it is that challenge, right? So it is, can be used for both. Even with COVID, obviously was raised as an issue where technology did facilitate and help, connect women who needed to access different programs. And so that was, I say that was probably one of the more positive things that came up in our discussion, was that example. And then otherwise, I think we were probably all a bit we found it a bit suspect, ICTs and how they can be used. So, also even with the apps, so not only are these big tech, having issues with our privacy and we're just handing it over, and that challenge that we need to address, but it's also stalking apps were brought up, right? So they're actually not just they're collecting this passive information on us on every time we use it, but also that there are actually apps that was brought up that are used for stalking. So, you know, it's big questions here. I'm just looking to see that we had a very interesting conversation. But it's like, how do we, and then sort of in terms of action, and I think it's like, how do we deal with this giant problem and challenge and take it back? It was kind of in some ways the questions at the end. And I think, you know, like one of the actions or a solution that came up was this idea of, you know, can we hack tech, or can we figure out a way to, you know, use technology to our advantage as feminists and have a global, you know, network to fight back in a way. And so I think those were kind of the main themes. But I think, you know, one other thing I just want to bring up too was the idea that, you know, what is happening on tech isn't like the violence on tech, in tech, isn't just in tech. And so that was kind of another thing, is it facilitates real life, like on the ground violence and trafficking. And so it's used to facilitate, you know, other violence against women and gender-based violence and other heinous things in real life. So it's like, you know, we can look at the abuse online and that type of, you know, that type of thing that's taking place, but it also, yeah, facilitates and enables other forms of abuse and violence. But I think I'll end there. I think, you know, there a lot came out, and I think it'll be an interesting summary document to put in our conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Jackie and Callie.
Sorry, finding the unmute. I feel like we focused, we talked about similar issues. I'm trying to think of what I can add here. Yeah, we talked about, I mean, the benefits of ICT use in a post-pandemic world, enabling folks to be able to connect from more of a grassroots level up to global networks, and what that's done for activists. The flip side of that being that there are obviously limitations around mobility, accessibility, digital literacy, that can present barriers to accessing that space and to sharing knowledge and knowing how information is being used. In terms of whose responsibility it is to prevent violence, we discussed various kind of institutional bodies, which was really interesting. So thinking about this within a government regulator space, from the perspective of the educational system and understanding what that looks like at a young age for children, all the way up to within university spaces, with the responsibility of administrations to be able to be aware of what's happening on campuses, for example. I'm trying to think if I skipped anything there. And then individual autonomy. So, I mean, this is connected to digital literacy as well, but the individuals themselves understanding how data is being used, and what that looks like, and how to disseminate information so that that's more readily accessible to people so they can exercise that autonomy over their information. And in terms of how to move towards a feminist regulatory framework, I mean, we kind of went back to the similar themes. I think the center of it was needing to define what violence or exploitation means from a feminist perspective. So potentially activists or groups working with government regulators in dialogue to be able to define those issues from using a feminist lens. Highlighting diversity and intersectional perspectives into that discussion. Teaching technology safety. We had an interesting discussion around conversations around consent in other spaces within educational systems, for example. But what would that look like to teach digital consent from a young age, and being able to kind of start at that level, but then again transcending that information at various levels within educational systems as well. And yeah, understanding this risk of violence is kind of interwoven throughout these conversations. So I think in summary, it's multifaceted, working with regulators, working with telecom to be able to kind of promote this messaging, using this feminist lens from the perspective of folks who are experiencing violence, or from the perspective of folks working on these issues, and then enabling individuals to exercise agency around this stuff. So Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jackie and Callie. It was so great to hear from our two panelists earlier, and then again now to hear such a variety of information and knowledge coming from all of our attendees. I don't know if we might have a minute or two if people have anything that they feel was not mentioned, if they want to jump in. No? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. It seems like there are definitely a few major themes that really permeated across our different groups. You know, there are a few major concerns in terms of the use of tech to facilitate and worsen gender-based violence, the ways in which it's used with stalking, harassment, hacking, revenge porn, and the lack of privacy that we're really afforded when using ICTs, and how to protect our personal information and online, and also how to protect, I think, each other as feminists online. You know, there was the concern around bias coded within the technology that we use, and how it is, you know, worsening existing oppressions that exist in our everyday lives as well. And it also seems like there's, you know, agreement that significantly more regulation is going to be needed to rein in big tech, but there's sort of a balancing act here when it comes to allowing governments to make so many of those decisions, and making sure that we are, you know, in those rooms making those decisions and affecting those decisions as much as we possibly can. We also discussed a lot of the benefits of ICTs on women and the feminist movement. One way is you know, in which ICTs can be used to share local resources for women who are seeking care or social support. Rhiannon mentioned that often. And then Noura also mentioned the examples of Me Too and feminist uprisings and movements in the Middle East, and how technology really allowed people from completely different parts of the world who would otherwise have really no way of communicating. You know, they've provided us this avenue to connect and build more feminist solidarity. But of course, greater access is definitely needed. And that's something that I've been thinking about as well. You know, access to ICTs often mirror access to other resources, which is that people who need them the most probably have the worst access. And especially rural communities and Indigenous communities in Canada have very poor access often to internet and ICTs. And so in order to continue this intersectional approach and build an intersectional framework, I think we need to make sure that everyone has that access as well. Clearly a really varied and intense topic, and not something that unfortunately we can solve today, although I wish I could, because it's been great to hear from all of you. And it would be really great to continue connecting going forward. I think today was also a really good reminder of the ways in which technology can be harnessed for good, especially within the feminist movement. It was really great to come together today from different locations and different time zones. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you so much to everyone who came out. It was so lovely to speak with you all today. Please do stay tuned on CRIA's website and our social media for updates on that summary report and on CRIA's other work. There's also a bunch of links in the chat from different resources that our panelists mentioned. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the last few days of NGO CSW. Thank you.